Hi there, I'm David Harvey, and I'm here with John Andrews, and this is the Two Texts Podcast. In this podcast, we're two friends in two different countries, here every 2 weeks, talking about two different texts from the Bible. This is our second season. It's about the miracles of Jesus, and this is episode 13, and it's called Water into Wine. So, John, we are changing from Luke's Gospel across to John's Gospel. Most scholars think that John's Gospel is probably the last of the Gospels to be written. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke, known as the Synoptic Gospels, from this Greek word of kind of almost seeing with one eye. And they feel very familiar, don't they? And it's as if John sat down and decided, I'm going to do a different type of Gospel. I often think about it like, it's like the Christopher Nolan version of the Gospel. It's kind of, I'm going to tell a story that you know, but I'm going to tell it in a very different way. And so, like, anyone that's engaged with John will realize, wait a minute, it starts differently. Matthew and Luke go, let's start with the beginning of Jesus' birth. John goes, how about we start with the beginning of creation? And then the stories are different as well. The way the whole gospel works is very, very different, which I think is a beautiful feature of John's gospel. But in a series about miracles, it means that we start to see some miracles that we've not seen before, miracles that we don't encounter elsewhere. And we're going to jump into John chapter 2 today, to the first miracle of Jesus's in here. And it's quite a miracle, isn't it?
It's fabulous. I was actually in Israel a few years ago doing the Jesus Trail. Sounds marvelously religious. It was just a really cool walk from Nazareth to Capernaum. Took us 4 days, my wife, myself, my oldest daughter, and my son-in-law. And one of the stop-offs was we walked from Nazareth to Cana. And they were genuinely trying to flog us bottles of wine that they were convincing us that Jesus may have had a hand in, actually. And I'm thinking that's a serious vintage. That's a serious vintage, people. So yeah, it's a phenomenal story, and I can't wait to get into it, David. Beautiful story given to us right at the beginning of John's Gospel. So let's do it.
So, well, let me read it then for us. So this is John chapter 2, the wedding at Cana. It says this: on the third day. It even starts, and you realize, wait a minute, John, what are you doing here? On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who drew the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk, but you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this, the first of his signs, in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory. And his disciples believed in him. After this, they went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they remained there a few days.
Fabulous. Come on. That would have been a great wedding to be part of. What do you reckon?
Wouldn't it just?
Serious.
Can you imagine?
I love it. I love, just as a general observation, I love the fact that, as happens so often in the ministry of Jesus, we see something of the glory of the Lord in the midst of the ordinary, the routine, the everyday. And you just get this incredible insight. It's almost, for me, David, a beautiful little nuance back to chapter 1 of John, of the incarnation itself. The Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us. And we have seen his glory. You get this gorgeous paradoxical tension of Jesus, as we understand him, as a human, so in a form that everybody gets, and yet somehow in that human form, there is magnificent revelation of glory. And I think in this beautiful wedding, you've just got an ordinary wedding. Something catastrophic has happened where wine is running out fast and they're in big trouble. And at a cultural level, they are in big trouble. And then we get this in this ordinary domestic scene. We get a revelation of his glory. And I love that. I love the otherness of this moment, and I also love the ordinariness of this moment. And I think that is a representation of the incarnation itself, and in terms of that. It's just chapter 2 following chapter 1 sort of thing.
The way that John sets it out, and I realize having just transitioned from Luke to John, you can get a bit of whiplash in terms of how you go about reading texts. And I feel like it's important for me to always spot that we saw this from time to time in Luke, where there was like a 2-level drama going on. There was like what's happening on the surface and then what's happening underneath. If you found that interesting in Luke, then you're going to love John, aren't you? Because this is happening all the time. So little throwaways like his use of time is very interesting. Like this, it starts on the third day.
Yes.
Right? So wait a minute, what's going on here? Because John's going to make a big deal of third days. He's actually, and there's even a sense he makes a big deal of the whole week, and perhaps that's something we can come back to today if there's time. And then there's also this reference to, this was the first of the signs, and your interpretation of that doesn't necessarily impact a huge deal how you just read this miracle story. But it's worth noting, isn't it, that John seems to pick up on 7 particular signs that journey us from the beginning of the story to the resurrection of Jesus, don't they?
I love the symmetry of many of the things that John does and the allusion to that. So you get 7 wonderful signs that this is the first one of, and in fact we're going to reflect on a few more in the Gospel of John in our podcast. And then of course you get, for John, you also get nuanced into that magnificently, the sort of 7 I am statements, which are massive ideas in the context of John positioning Jesus as not simply the Savior of the world, but the embodiment of the I am of God. He is I am. And you're getting these magnificent sort of markers all the way through the gospel. It is as if John is putting down breadcrumbs and just begging us to pick them up and follow the trail. And we are introduced at, it seems, an amazing consistency. These glorious ideas, these glorious revelations of Jesus, and also glimpses of his glory in these beautiful miracles. So there is a consistent pattern. And of course, John writes at the end. I mean, he sort of gives us the reason for his writing right at the end. I'm writing these things so that you will believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. So there's no doubt that he's trying to establish the magnificence and otherness of Jesus and his glory.
Yes. So there are these 7 signs, and I think it's worth just spending a moment talking about them a little bit more, because it actually helps us, I think, understand a little bit of what John's doing in his gospel. So I made an allusion to it at the very start. How do you start a gospel? Well, Mark starts his gospel by Jesus just sort of exploding onto the scene in his ministry, isn't he? It's like, well, let's just begin. Yes, Jesus appears, John the Baptist in the desert, we're off. Luke and Matthew, of course, then begin their gospel with this kind of birth story of Jesus, rooting into fulfillment of prophecy, hope for the future, and this sort of thing. John, like I say, he does something phenomenal in his gospel, where I think he rewrites Torah. So we grow up with, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was void and formless. And you get to the start of John's gospel. Imagine you're a Jewish person. You've grown up with these texts. And John starts his gospel. In the beginning. Amazing. Was the Word. So he actually now tells you a new creation story, and I use that term on purpose because it's quite interesting. It's a new version of the creation story. So where this gets interesting then is you start to see John talking about days quite a lot. Right? This happened on the third day. The third day. If you actually what do we mean by the third day? The third day of what? Third day of the week? Third day since Jesus had last been to a wedding? Like, if you just look at it as a standalone, it's not clear what the third day is until you start to realize that it's the third day of John's gospel that's happening here. Why that's significant for me is you have to go all the way to the end of John's gospel. And I think it's Tom Wright that first sort of alerted me to this in one of his books, that if you go to the start of the resurrection story at the end of John's gospel, the intro to that story is, it was the beginning of the week. Right? And so what we see John sort of doing is that you've had this kind of 7-day-old creation, which is rewritten in Jesus. And then the resurrection starts the beginning of new creation, which roots you into the stories of Isaiah and all this sort of thing. But once you've caught that idea, you then hang on top of that these 7 signs, right? Which are all signs about the control of Jesus, the creative ability of Jesus. So Jesus can walk on water, create food, heal the sick, make the lame walk, blind people who were unable to see from birth, and he can even change water into wine. And now there's 7 of them. And there's quite a big discussion amongst scholars as to what the 7 are, right? Because some scholars say there's the changing of water into wine. There's the healing of the official son in John chapter 4. There's the man who can't walk in John chapter 5. And then the question is, in John chapter 6, is there the feeding of the 5,000 and then the walking on water? Or are they one miracle story together? Then there's the man in John 9 who is born unable to see. Great story that we'll talk about soon. And then there's the raising of Lazarus. And the question for a lot of people is the 7th miracle the raising of Lazarus? Or is Jesus' resurrection the 7th miracle story? And it's kind of almost, however you cut the pie, it's a pretty impressive way to put the gospel together.
Phenomenal.
Isn't it?
Oh, phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. And in the same way that if you really want to get the Torah, you've got to get Genesis 1:1. Do you know what I mean? So you are struggling to understand the intricacy, connectedness, dynamism, and glory of Torah unless you're prepared to humbly bow down to Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God creates, the heavens and the earth. 7 glorious words in Hebrew. And of course, I absolutely see the unmissable parallel in the Gospel of John, that you cannot get what John is trying to say in his version of the creation week and the new week that begins post-resurrection in Christ Jesus. You don't get that unless you are prepared to start with humility and say, he is the Word and he was there at the beginning and nothing is here without him. And of course, that's a game changer for many people, isn't it? So we can, many sort of ideas in the world can sit comfortably with a sort of a creation story, however you cut that. But once you get into a gospel that says, actually, the vocal point of this whole story is in the person of Jesus, then it is tremendously divisive, but also incredibly glorious. And if we get that in the beginning was the Word, and grab it and accept it, then the Gospel of John just opens up in the same way that the creation story opens up the Torah and helps us to get the heart of God. So for me, it's the genius of John. I mean, this is a brilliant piece of writing. And sometimes, as you say, people, because we try to read John's Gospel in the way we maybe read Luke's, which is a bit more narrative-y feeling. Luke reads like a story, and it really is cool to follow, and it has a beginning and an end and a middle that we sort of identify. And then we try to read John like that, and we've actually got to put on a completely different set of glasses to sort of read John, because John's not telling us a story. John is unpacking the glory of what has been, what is, and what will be. It's just an incredible gospel and filled with genius, absolute genius.
I believe all the Gospels are theology, but But John is the one that probably most lets his theological point drive the story.
Sure.
So anyone reading John needs to be aware of the fact that John is doing these things to make theological points to you. You mentioned it already. He says at the end in chapter 20, verse 30, there are many other signs that Jesus did, but I've not told you about them. Right? And because these signs have been told to tell you something specific, right? And to draw you into something specific, isn't it? So
true.
Things like in John's gospel, you're going to find Jesus' clearing of the temple really early in the story. And it's important to remember that's probably not being driven by chronology. That's being driven that John wants you to get a theological point about Jesus early. He doesn't want to keep you to the end to get that. I need you to know this now. So therefore, I'm going to tell it to you now.
Absolutely.
Which is why I sometimes call it the Christopher Nolan of Gospels, right? When you watch his stories, some of his films where you're watching it and you're going, there's more going on here than I am aware.
Yeah.
And I'm going to need to read this a second time or maybe a third time to track it.
Yes, absolutely.
And so I want to encourage people to take your advice then, that opening piece, that chapter 1, sort of verses 1 through to about verse 18, you want to almost have that memorized. Right? Maybe if you can't recite it, that's fair enough, but you want to have it in your mind. Because, so if you think about, let's just give me an example, verse 3, all things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. Right? Yeah. So that's verse 3 of John's Gospel, chapter 1. So now jump back over to our miracle story. And Jesus' mother says, they've got no wine. Yeah. and Jesus is like, well, what's that really got to do with us? But what's fascinating to me is that when does the miracle happen? Well, we don't know. But John wants you to know this shouldn't surprise you, because I've already told you that nothing comes into being without Jesus. So there's almost a sense that he can underplay the physical mechanics of the miracle story because you're in the presence of the person who created everything. Right? Yeah. In a few verses' time, Jesus is going to be sat beside a well. Jesus, the living water of life, and the lady's going to say to him, "But you don't have anything to pull water out of the well with." And John wants you to laugh at this and see the irony of saying these things to Jesus. I don't know. Do you resonate with that, John? That's how I kind of read this Cana story.
For sure. You brought a beautiful reflection for our listeners when reading Luke. Try and get into the ideas contained in the Magnificat and some of the statements of Zechariah, and some of those ideas that are clearly almost programmatic for Luke. They open up gorgeous little ideas that well, they're not little ideas, they're massive ideas, which then are seeded all the way through the gospel. So you're seeing links, which Luke is doing brilliantly and cleverly. I think John's, what's sometimes referred to as John's prologue, is one of the finest pieces of introduction to any work that you could have. It is stunningly brilliant, and I think what John is doing is setting up. He's sort of saying, right, I'm going to throw a lot of stuff at you, but here's the framework through which to understand it. Here's the pair of glasses. Put those on, and you'll be able to read everything I'm about to say through those glasses. You'll see them properly. And that is, I would urge that upon our readers, because if you jump into these stories in isolation, if you jump into these stories in a vacuum, and we've been urging them, of course, never ever try to do that. Try and always place them in their context. But of course, in John's Gospel, you're not simply placing some of these stories in the context of the passage. You need to place them in the context of John's overall commitment and what he's trying to build. Yes. And if you want to see what John's trying to build, the first 18 verses will rock your world. So that's the framework he's building. The law comes by Moses, but grace and truth came from Jesus. That Jesus came from the Father full of grace and truth. And all through the Gospel of John, we're seeing grace and truth, grace and truth, grace and truth, over and over and over and over again. And you get the magnificence of that. And so the prologue sets us up, builds us a frame, whatever analogy you want to use, gives us a lens through which to view these magnificent stories.
John is a grown-up's gospel, right? And by that, I don't mean don't read it to your children. What I mean is I think John thinks you, the reader, are very clever, right? And so John doesn't patronize you as a reader, and he doesn't make things simple for you. So it's like, I think he says, read the prologue, and I expect you to remember this, because I'm going to say things elsewhere. So the one that comes to me, just as an example, is in John chapter 7, the Pharisees get involved in an argument about where Jesus is from, right? Yeah. And the funny thing is, if you just read John chapter 7, John never really clarifies the answer to the problem. Mm-hmm. And so if you just read John chapter 7, as we as Christians often do, I'm just going to jump into John chapter 7 today, we go, well, that's a little strange because it's not really clear what the answer to this question is. Mm-hmm. But I think John thinks you're clever enough to remember what he said already. Yeah. The Pharisees are arguing about whether Jesus comes from Bethlehem or Galilee or whatever. And John's like, well, I told you back in chapter 1, exactly. He comes from God, right? And so why are you arguing about what house he was born in? And I think that's, for me, that encouraged me to remind me that when I engage with John, he doesn't want to make it simple for me because there's more depth. He's inviting me to think more deeply about what he's doing. And I wonder sometimes if even he uses the story of the wedding in the Cana to lean me into that, to say, okay, wait a minute, just let me show you how a miracle can work when the Creator is present amongst us, and starts to sort of push that a little bit along.
Yeah, and I think it's a great encouragement to people who are seeking to engage with the Bible that don't be put off by something that looks a bit difficult. Don't be put off by something that doesn't come to you easily. Remember, these writers are building an incredible story, that there's a context to that story in terms of their Jewish world. And yes. John would expect his Jewish audience to really get some of these ideas really, 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 really quickly, even if they were very controversial and very difficult. But actually for us who are coming to this ancient text 21 centuries later, there are enough clues within John's gospel to help us work our way through it and not be completely bamboozled by some of these things. But we must not fall into the trap of taking individual statements of Jesus out of the dynamic, fluent, cohesive context of John's prologue. And once you see that, then it will help to connect the dots in terms of what we're doing in that gospel. So it really, really is important. Any leaders or preachers out there listening to us, dig into the prologue, saturate yourself in that, and then the gospel will suddenly look and sound very, very different as you do so.
And being careful to note how John uses characters, how he expresses people, how he introduces people to us. And you look at Nicodemus as an example in John's gospel. He comes at night from the dark to the light of the world. Yeah. And then he slowly develops over the course of this gospel to becoming a person of who defends Jesus and then looks after Jesus. And John, I think, is arcing something for you there. Oh, look what happens when you follow Jesus. This is what's going on. And so I think it's really important stuff to say what we're saying here, that look carefully, look at what people are saying, look at how they're phrasing things. It's such a fun gospel to spend time in.
It's phenomenal. It's phenomenal. Yeah, I love John's gospel, and the more I dig into John's gospel, the more I am completely overwhelmed by the glory of this incarnational moment. The Word becomes flesh and makes his dwelling, sets up his tent among us so that we can see his glory. And at the wedding in Cana, we get a glimpse into his glory, which is just pretty spectacular, really, and fun as well. Yeah.
So let's jump in there then, John. Let's spend a few minutes in this actual wedding itself. Where do you want to start?
I love the fact he was just invited. I think it's fab. I remember years and years ago watching an old movie of Jesus. I think it was called The Greatest Story Ever Told. And I remember watching as a kid thinking, wow, this is fabulous. And then I watched it as an adult and thought, who is that? And I suddenly realized the Jesus that they were setting up was pretty bland and boring and other, and certainly not Jewish. I mean, the guy that was set up for he was definitely absolutely not Jewish. And you're going, oh my goodness, that's terrible. I'm not sure I would follow that Jesus to the end of the street. What I love about this is that Jesus and his disciples get the invite. So there's clearly Jesus, though his ministry is beginning and starting to gather momentum, he is clearly still deeply, intimately connected to his community. He's connected enough to be invited to ordinary events like weddings. And he is down to earth enough to accept the invitation. And I love that. And I love the fact that we cannot imagine then Jesus and his disciples not dancing at this wedding, not engaging in the joy and the laughter and the fun at this wedding. It's impossible to imagine that couldn't have happened. He would have embraced this moment as a good Jewish man and enjoyed every moment if he remained there every moment of the week of that wedding feast if he wanted to stay there. So it, and of course it's remembering this is an event. I mean, this is like for us in the West, we rock up to a wedding service and a 45-minute service or a 1-hour service and then a bit of a reception afterwards and then we all go home or maybe there's a bit of a dance and a disco afterwards or something. But it's essentially, it's done in half a day, this thing. We're in, we're out and we're gone. A Jewish wedding in the world of Jesus, this is a week-long event and this is celebration, this is joy, this is life, this is at the very centre of the community. And also this is a hugely important honour moment for the family. So when we're about to discover that the wine is running out or has run out, this is a catastrophic cultural moment in that world.
I think it would probably be still true to this day that if you hosted a big party and ran out of something to drink during the party, it would be a little embarrassing. But then you've got this role of Mary then in the text, haven't you? That she now comes along and is the catalyst for something to happen. And I love this interaction where she's like, well, they don't have any wine. And Jesus, he comes across a little abrupt. Most of the English translations soften a little bit. But his sort of answer to her is like, woman, what is there between us? Right? Yeah. The observant Greek student will realize that this is the same phrase that Jesus is asked by demons on a couple of occasions, where they say to Jesus, "What is there between us?" And Jesus says, "Woman, what is there between us?" But then that my hour has not yet come. And now you get another Johannine theme enters the fray, doesn't it?
It does. It does, because obviously I think on every occasion, I've counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 occasions apart from this one. So again, magic number of 7 there in John's Gospel. On 7 occasions when Jesus references hour in that way, he is generally and almost explicitly referring to the hour of his death, his crucifixion. Yes. So it's interesting that Jesus, that the response of Jesus in what seems to be a mum reaching out to her son saying, any chance you can help here? And there is a little interesting sideways nuance here, David, which it could be a red herring, could be useful. My research has shown that in first century Jewish weddings, that sometimes the guests would also contribute to the cost of the wedding. So it wasn't just all on the family, that there would be a sense in which actually the community would contribute depending on the circumstances of the family. And so if Mary has discovered they've run out of wine, it's like she's turning to Jesus and can you make a contribution here? Can you help out in some way or another? It's interesting. There's nothing from the text that's suggesting she's expecting him to do a miracle, but she is expecting him to do something. But his response clearly is leaning into a response from him that he's about to do something much greater than maybe she's even asking, and linking this to this hour of crucifixion. So it's a very interesting. Are they on the same wavelength, or is there a sort of are they speaking the same language but divided by sort of a meaning here, a different meaning? And it is a very powerful moment. What's this got to do with me, sort of thing?
And I love how then she then turns around to the servants and says, "Just do whatever he says." Okay,
a good Jewish mother. She just ignores him and just says, "Oh yeah, just do what he says."
So then there's this question where John throws in, there were standing there 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification. Again, you want to think a little bit about the numbers that are going on here. This what's John doing? 6, not 7. I mean, a lot of scholars say they all feel, the problem with John's gospel is when you see numbers, you feel like something must be going on, but most scholars say, actually, it's not really obvious if this number 6 is of any significance. But what does seem to be significant, that these water jars, it's not a pile of drinks bottles over in the corner. They're jars, John tells you, for the Jewish rites of purification. That's an interesting little take, isn't it? That is there, because in John's gospel, there is this tension around the developing of the story, isn't there? So you've said it already, grace and truth comes through Jesus. The law came through Moses, grace and truth. There's this, and I know some scholars have, historically, this has become a source of some anti-Semitism, and John's gospel has become uncomfortable in a lot of these places. I often think that while we definitely want to be aware of all of that, John is writing in the late 1st century, not aware of how people are going to abuse his text in the future. And so I think for John to say, I'm seeing progression and growth, we're growing from what God was doing through us as Israel and into what God's doing for us now in Christ. I think John can say that without being anti-Israel, without being anti-Jewish. John himself appears to be Jewish. So I think... Yes, exactly. So I feel like without dismissing people's modern day concerns, we can let John be John at some level and work that out. But it strikes me as interesting that we've, again, go back to the prologue, the law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. So John has alerted us to, you're going to see some progression in this story. Yes. And is there a level of which, now that Jesus is here, maybe we don't need these purification jars for what they used to be used for. So now we're going to do something else with them. I mean, because bear in mind this, just a little comment, and then I'd love to know whether you agree with me. Notice what the bridegroom says. He says, oh, wait a minute, this order's back to front. No, ordinarily, you start with the good and things get worse. But this wedding,
indeed,
things started not great and are getting better. And isn't that a commentary on what John is doing in Jesus? John's saying the story is arcing upwards. The story is getting better, not worse. So I wonder if there's something subtle going on in that, John.
Absolutely. And I think we can read John too and just see at one level water into wine, and the wedding gets saved and people's cultural embarrassments are delivered, as it were. But of course, it's these little details in the story that are all leaning into something. And if we started from the trajectory of in the beginning was the Word, the Word's made flesh, the Word's come in grace and truth, then there are clues that John is dropping all the way through. And I think it is not a stretch to say in taking especially the jars used for ceremonial washing and then producing something brand new in them. And not just brand new, spectacularly brand new. I mean, where the master of the banquet is going, this is the best wine. Why are you serving it at the end when normally you serve the bad stuff at the end? So
when nobody cares anymore.
When nobody cares, when they're maybe not even noticing what they're drinking. So it's not even just that he's used the ceremonial jars, but it is the fact that he has produced something of spectacular quality. Out of water, he has produced wine. And I think, David, if you then lean further on into the chapter and you see Jesus in John's chronology, then going to Jerusalem and doing what he does at the temple, for me, there is an unmissable link between the water and the wine and, in John's chronology, the immediate cleansing of the temple. Something that the temple stands as the core symbol of what Moses represents. It's the core embodiment of Tanakh and the center of Judaism in the Jewish world. And immediately after changing water into wine, Jesus heads there and creates a moment of controversy where he is cleansing out what is in order to make room for something new and something better. And that's an unmissable idea. And I'm deeply saddened by the sort of anti-Semitic suggestions around John. I really I can't see it anywhere. I think as an Irishman, I can say things about Irishmen sometimes that I can get away with things because I'm Irish, and you're able to say things knowing that this is not about race and it's not about superiority. It's simply about I can call it because I live in it. And I think with John, you get a straightforwardness around some of his progressional arguments where he's saying, actually, we're moving on from Moses to Jesus. It's set up for us in the prologue. We're moving into grace and truth. Oh, and here's the first representation of that when we see water in ceremonial jars transformed into spectacularly amazing wine. And then immediately the cleansing of the temple. I don't think those things are unconnected. I think there's a flow that John's really making a strong point there.
And you've got this purification idea going on as well, haven't you, with the purification jars and even little things that you want to notice in the nuance of the story. Like I love the volume. Like these jars are huge. like Jesus, they don't have any wine. Well, what about 120 gallons of wine then? Will that help? And sometimes I wonder if that's just, again, the creation miracle happening. Like when God does it, he does it, right? And it's powerful. But prior to that, prior to it becoming wine, notice Jesus, we're talking about this arc that John's plotting, that Jesus is changing the trajectory. Even little comments like, and they filled them, Jesus has filled his jars with water, and they filled them up to the brim.
To the brim.
Right? And the Greek seems to almost say until they were upward. Like it's again, that wouldn't make a lot of sense in English, but the whole idea is they're filling them up. There's movement going on in John's gospel. And in any other gospel, you might think, oh goodness, David, you're stretching it a bit there. But with John, every word seems to be so carefully chosen to drive you towards the conclusions that he's going to make. This is the third day that this happens. In a few verses' time, Jesus is going to be standing outside the temple saying, destroy it and we'll raise it up on the third day. So it's all intermeshed, isn't it?
It seems like it to me. And again, we're trying to help our listeners understand the genius of these gospel writers. John, by the time he writes his gospel, he is really considering how Jesus is going to be presented not just to the Jewish world, but to the burgeoning Gentile world in which the church is expanding. And he wants them to get this stuff. He wants them to absolutely understand that these ideas are all interconnected. And so, absolutely, I think we have to be careful. We don't want to see things where there aren't things. But I think when you realize the cleverness of these writers, there's probably more cases where there is something there than where there isn't. And I do love that. And I even love the idea. For me, you sort of leaned into it earlier on, David. We're not even sure when the miracle happens. He sort of, the implication is he draws out water. And then says, okay, and you just imagine the servant going, what? I'm going to be carrying like a jar of water to the master of the banquet, and he's going to go bananas at me. And so you're sort of somewhere between drawing that water out and that water hitting his lips. It's transformed. And again, I love the idea of the transformative power of God in the going. In the journey, in the progression. It's something is happening as we are journeying here. It isn't just instantaneous and immediate and obvious, but something is happening as we're journeying towards this.
It's almost as if, and this is again something you see regularly in John's Gospel, that he thinks you, the reader, already know the story because he does, like you say, there's no point where the miracle actually happens. It just it happens. It's there, and it's not. But then what's also interesting to me, John, is that notice verse 9. The master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. And that's it. That's your moment of shock. Yeah. And he did not realize where it had come from, although the servants who had drawn the water knew. Right? So then he has this conversation with the bridegroom. Clearly, the master of the banquet assumes you've just been snatching some wine out the bag, right? And as best as we see in this story, this is never clarified. Right? Except then by verse 11, it says, this is the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory. And there's almost a question of, well, who did he reveal his glory to?
Indeed. It's something that I've reflected on before. If you were wanting to sort of really grab a glory moment, that's the moment Jesus steps forward and says, ta-da! It was me. It was me, everyone. I'm the winemaker. And it's almost as if Jesus is keeping this as low profile, or certainly drawing as little attention directly to himself as possible, except for those in the know. And I'm not sure what's going on there, but again, leaning back to some of our parable stuff, I want to lean into this idea, David, that Jesus is so supremely confident in the glory that he's revealing, that even if it's just revealed to a handful of servants in the room, it's the beginning of this change. It's the beginning of this thing. He's actually, I mean, I can just imagine some of the disciples sort of going, come on, let's tell everybody what we've done. Let's tell everybody what's going on here. Now, John will eventually tell this story to the world, but it looks like most people in the wedding feast don't actually know it's your man from Nazareth that has rocked the water pots and turned this stuff into first-class wine. So, and yet Jesus is so secure with this demonstration of glory that even though there's a relatively small group of people getting to see it, he goes, hey, just let the glory, let my glory just work and move. I love this about Jesus. I love his profound sense of security in the kingdom, in his word, in his miracles, in what he's about, because if that was me and you, that would be on Twitter. You know what I mean? That's an Instagram moment right there. Come on. Let's have a Wi-Fi together. Come on. Instagram moment coming up. And actually Jesus it seems to me Jesus just returns to the wedding and maybe drinks a glass of the wine that he's just transformed. So
or potentially even just leaves. Verse 12. After this, he went off to Capernaum.
Which again, incidentally, is not an easy walk. I mean, that's a serious. When I walked from Cana to Capernaum, I mean, I suppose you could do it quicker, but that took us 3 days. So, and it's really difficult terrain, and it's all downhill, which is good, although there's a lot of undulations. But so this is not an easy walk for him and his mother and his friends. Yeah. So yes, they leave and head home to Capernaum.
So holding all of the sort of text together then, holding these two stories, the revelation of Jesus' glory as the creator of this wine, contrasting then with what he's about to then go and do in Jerusalem, the way that John tells the story, you're getting a little bit of a key, I think, in terms of how to read John's miracle stories. These are signs. So John 20, verse 30, there are other signs I could have told you, but I told you these ones so that you would trust in Jesus as the Messiah. Yeah. I think that's what's going on, which is why Jesus, at some level, doesn't need the ta-da, it was me moment. That what we're seeing at some level is an interesting question about a modern day theology of miracles, actually, is that what is Jesus doing here? Is Jesus just randomly, you might want to say, goodness, with all the sick people in the world, Jesus decides that the miracle he's going to do is help some people get a bit more drunk, potentially, right? Yeah. That doesn't seem quite right. And that's if we're assuming that Jesus' miracle ministry was just Jesus just doing random miracles. What John really, I think, helps us focus in is the miracles have purpose. And you'll see this when we get to John chapter 9. Well, what are we going to do with this man who's blind? It's about the incoming of this of God himself with us, isn't it? And you see that it's about this revelation of his glory to the people that Jesus wants to see it. It's really quite powerful, isn't it?
It is. And of course, this beautiful little statement in verse 11, for me, connects back to one of the greatest statements in the prologue. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory. So I think once you read John chapter 2, verse 11, through the lens of John chapter 1, verse 14 and onwards, then actually this is what John is doing. He's connecting certain ideas specifically to the glory of Jesus. And he wants us to understand that each of these are a revelation of his glory. They're not just random events, but they are connected to the revealing of his glory, so that we understand that this man before us is the Word, the creator and the sustainer of the universe, and he became flesh among us. And John wants us to see that Jesus dancing in the wedding is actually the creator and the sustainer and the savior of the world. So it's a beautiful connector all the way through.
I mean, I almost want to just to help. Someone's with us in their car right now, so probably unsafe to just quickly grab their New Testament and leaf to John chapter 1. I know that it's in the car with them, but I don't want them reading it while they're driving. But just let me pick out some highlights here. So we've read and considered this wedding at Cana and the miracle there. But just you've made a couple of allusions, John, but let me just string a few more of them. So verse 3 you've said already. Okay, so well, let's begin. In the beginning was the Word. So it's this creation. The Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things that came into being through him. So without him, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in him was life, and the life was the light of all people. And the light shines in the darkness. So you've got this sense that you can even see this happening in our story. Like, well, what actually is going on here? Where did this wine come from? What's Jesus going to do? We don't know what he's going to do, but the light is going to shine. Look at verse 9. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. Like, once again, overlay that over. Here's some wine. Okay, how did this wine come? It came through Jesus. Does anybody know that? No. Right? So you see what I'm doing in this? It's just, but he came to his own people. They didn't always accept him, but whoever received him and believed in his name, he gave power to become the children of God. And then you've got the verse 14, he became flesh, lived amongst us, and we have seen his glory. So what I'm hoping just is that slow read through of just a couple of the verses there is to see how often you can overlay that prologue onto the miracle and say, oh, okay, that's again happening in this little microcosm. There's a bit of confusion around Jesus. There's a lack of clarity around Jesus, but the people that want to see or commit to seeing can see that this is Creator God become flesh and dwelling amongst us. Beautiful. Okay, so that's it for the first episode this week. Our second text for this week releases on Thursday. If you want to get in touch with either of us about something we said, you can reach out to us on podcast@twotext.com or by liking and following the Two Text Podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you left a review on your podcast app or one of our social media sites. And if you really enjoyed this episode, why not share it with a friend? Don't forget that you can listen to every episode over on www.twotexts.com or wherever you get your podcasts. But that is it for this episode. We're back on Thursday, so until then, goodbye.